Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Gavin Cleesby, the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I'm delighted to welcome a good-sized crowd for the program this evening. For anyone who may be attending a virtual program at MHS for the first time, we are an independent nonprofit organization that maintains a research library with millions of pages of correspondence, documents, and printed material for researchers of all types. Thanks to the support of our members, we're also able to host a wide variety of programs on subjects related to Massachusetts and American history. Because of the support of our donors, we can offer our programs for free and keep our library open to the public. We hope you'll return for future events. And if you enjoy our programs or doing research in our library, we hope you'll consider supporting our work by becoming a member. This evening, we are joined by Professor Christina Groeger, who will be discussing her new book, The Education Trap: Schools and the Remaking of Inequality in Boston, which explores the seemingly contradictory facts that although more people are earning degrees, the gap between rich and poor is widening. Professor Groeger is an assistant professor in the Department of History at Lake Forest College. She studies historical construction of work, schools, and labor markets, and how these institutions have created a society with one of the highest levels of social inequality across the global north. Professor Groeger received her bachelor's degree from Harvard University, an MPhil in political thought from the University of Cambridge, and her PhD in history from Harvard. Professor Groeger will be joined in conversation by Professor Michael Glass. Professor Glass is a political and urban historian of the 20th century United States. He teaches at Boston College, and his research interests focus on racism, capitalism, and inequality. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago, an MS from the City University of New York, an MA from Hunter College, and his PhD from Princeton University. So without further ado, I'm happy to welcome Professor Groeger and Professor Glass to the program.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much to the Massachusetts Historical Society for the invitation and to everybody for tuning in. I'm new to Boston myself this year, so it's really exciting to start connecting with people. Although I look forward to a time when we can start doing these events somewhere other than little Zoom boxes. So tonight, most of all, is a celebration of Professor Groeger's recently released book, The Education Trap. As I think our conversation will convince you, it's really a remarkable achievement. It's an impressive amount of research that's elegantly written and argued throughout and has really profound implications, which we'll get to talking about. We'll discuss the material, some of the implications, and our conversation is going to run till about 6:15. And at that point, we'll take questions from the audience for the last 15 minutes. So the question box is open throughout our whole conversation. You have a question now or one arises throughout, please send that and we'll get to those in the last 15 minutes. So I thought I'd just say a few things first before we get into some questions for Professor Groeger. So I think maybe we could start with one statistic that helps kind of frame this book. In 1880, roughly 50% of teenagers in Boston attended high school. By 1920, that figure is up to 90%. So we go from a time when about half of teenagers are attending school on a regular basis to where it really becomes the norm. And this period of educational transformation coincides with the rise of the corporate economy. And as part of this consolidation process, there was unprecedented levels of economic inequality, so much so that this came to be known as the Gilded Age. And while we of course, are well aware of these parallel developments, they've been kind of treated as separate developments. And so what the Education Trap shows us is that the expansion of public education and of economic inequality are not separate phenomena, but actually very connected, and helps show us precisely why that happened, the relationship between schooling and labor, all told through an urban history of Boston. So I want to just highlight three of my favorite parts of the book. So the first is the boldness of your argument. It really forces us to question some of our assumptions and deeply held beliefs about education as a great equalizer and as an engine of social mobility. And as historians, we specialize in hindsight. There's often a sharp divide between the past and present that some historians are hesitant to broach in talking about contemporary politics. but I really appreciate you not hiding from the contemporary implications of your argument and really engaging those in the book. The second thing that I really love is the sophistication of your methodology. So as I think you're going to show us with some slides, you have some really complex quantitative statistical methods to trace changes in schooling and labor markets with really elegant graphs, things that I think would make any social scientist very proud. And then coupled with that, just a real stunning array of historical archives. From your footnotes, it looks like you've ransacked a number of archives all over the Boston region, and then have managed to piece this all back together to reconstruct what daily life was like during this really transformative period. And throughout that, have a real eye for characters, for vignettes, for stories, for kind of, you really get a sense of what life was like for various groups of people living through these things. And the third thing that I really love is your intersectional analysis. So this book is about inequality, but I think more specifically, it's about stratification and the way various hierarchies persisted throughout these changes, according to race, class, ethnicity, gender, among others. And not to elevate one of these, because that's the whole point of your intersectional analysis, but I really do think that the gender analysis throughout the book just really shines. I was really struck reading you showing us precisely how certain jobs like secretarial work and teaching became feminized, with some real eye-popping evidence at times about this sort of gendering of certain types of work as masculine and feminine. So I'm sure we'll circle back to each of these things about your argument, methodology, and analysis. But I think first, I think people really appreciate hearing kind of the story behind a book. So can you tell us just kind of how did you settle on this topic, and why did you decide to write it?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mike. And also thank you to the Mass Historical Society, where what was one of the archives that I visited in Boston and doing this research, and runs a series of seminars and workshops where I presented early versions of this work. So it's really nice to be able to share a little bit about the final book. So how did I end up writing this book? Well, so I guess the origin story is, back even in undergrad, I was really interested in visions that were mostly in the early 20th century, or authors in the early 20th century that include people like John Dewey, a kind of famous democratic theorist and educational philosopher, who saw education as, not just a means of transforming society, but also equalizing it, like to transform the economy as well. And looking at this time period and what happens with inequality, despite these sort of grand visions, this really didn't happen. And I'll just show you quickly a chart that I use a lot in teaching about inequality. But the early 20th century, a time period when schools, as Mike pointed out, were really expanding, was also a time when inequality was going up, and then fell later, and then now basically we're seeing rates of inequality at the same levels that we saw in this early time period. So it seemed like figuring out what was really going on in this early 20th century moment, despite the ideas of people like John Dewey, what happened. And that led me to a project that is sort of a social history, a labor history, and an educational history, to try to piece together how education and the economy were really interacting and kind of grew up together. And what I find is, as education was expanding, it was really important in giving certain groups of people access to better jobs. At the same time, it became this new basis of inequality based on educational credentials and degrees that I think now we're sort of seeing play out in full force again. in our present moment. So that's kind of the arc, of where I ended up with this book.
Maybe we can get right into some of the specifics of your argument there. So this is another key development in this period is what's known as the progressive era of these various attempts at social reform. And so you have really important stories of vocational education. And so you mentioned that in some cases, educational credentials provided more economic opportunities for people, and in other cases, these reform efforts did not work out. Do you want to maybe talk about some of those examples?
Sure, yeah. So I think the sort of success story of this period, or the period that I also see as, consolidating an ideology about education as a means of social mobility, was really what was happening in white collar work. And I'll show you, this is sort of a, an illustration of like the type of both workers and the types of jobs that were expanding in a new corporate economy. Jobs like accounting and bookkeeping, secretaries, typists, stenographers. These were some of the fastest growing jobs in the economy at the time, not just for men, but also for women. And I'll talk a little bit more about sort of methods in a minute, but this is one of the charts that I have in the book that I create with census data dating from this period. And clerical and sales work, you can see, slightly expands for men, and for women, goes from 6% of the women's workforce to almost 40%. So a huge growth of clerical and sales work. And that, the primary way that women and men begin to access this work changes from sort of informal, you might work if you have a family connection to a business owner, you might mentor alongside them in an office. And this really shifts in this sector of work to schools providing this kind of formal training in business. And so you see the growth of for-profit, essentially for-profit schools that are providing business and commercial training. And then the public high school becomes sort of the main provider of this kind of training, and is responding to real student demand for the skills that would be relevant for white collar work. That's a very successful story. Just to give one example of a failure, but I think is based on the same idea that like, just, if you only provide more skills, this can sort of help students access better work, access better pay, was what I find that progressive reformers launched. Well, they're very concerned with domestic workers, which from that chart that I had up on the screen is the other largest sector of work for women. And they began schools of housekeeping that they thought, if only domestic workers had more skills, this would sort of elevate the status of the occupation of being a domestic worker, and raise wages and sort of lead to better outcomes. And the problem there is that this was a field that, was low status, low wage. Women were desperately leaving this type of work and trying to go into other things like clerical work, which was cleaner and paid better, had more freedom. So basically these schools of housekeeping totally failed, and nobody showed up to take these classes, and they all sort of shut down within a few years. So while I think the success story actually like helped consolidate this ideology, that education was a good way of improving work, but it really depended on where in the economic ladder, these occupations were located, to actually be successful.
Well, and I mean, maybe this would be a place that I think you really have something to say about shaking up the way we think about this notion of skill. Even the language we've started using: high skill, low skill, unskilled occupations. Uh, can you say a bit about how you want us to think about skills differently, particularly in what types of skills students are getting in school that actually unlock economic opportunities, and in what cases, in some you just gave, that this connection didn't work out in the way people thought they would?
Yeah. So that's something that kind of I come back to throughout the book, and I think I basically avoid using the word unskilled or skilled work as sort of descriptors, because I don't think it's actually those words are very misleading, right? Like domestic service, cooking, right? Elaborate dishes, like that's not an unskilled. That kind of work actually takes skill, but traditionally feminized, racialized jobs that are sort of personal service, or jobs that take place in the home that are learned informally. These are the kinds of jobs that usually are low wage. They pay, or they're sort of devalued in the labor market. What is usually thought of as sort of unskilled work, I think, is more to do with the sort of low amount of power that the workers who perform that type of work have in the economy. And so that's sort of rethinking, the problematic use of the word unskilled. And I think in terms of the kinds of skills that are relevant in the workforce, I trace sort of the shift in most of the economy from a sort of informal training model to a school-based model of training for most types of work. But the kinds of skills that students are getting in schools is also varied. And for white collar work, I think that's a case where you do see like real, there's technical skills to be learned, like how to do bookkeeping, how to use a typewriter. But there's also a lot of gendered performance, sort of correct manners, correct speech, something for telephone operators that was really important, that you had unaccented speech. And then when you get to, the professions and some of the higher occupations, what I found, basically what employers were looking for, often described as, looking for a college man or sort of for an educated man. But what that meant was often, a proxy for racial or ethnic kind of characteristics, other sorts of indicators of class status, and a lot of these traits, could be whether or not different extracurriculars were emphasized, was often a way of indicating your class status. So there were lots of things that were relevant to accessing jobs, and were basically what schools could help, in some cases, could help provide, or at least provide this sort of cover that didn't have to do with like technical skill that we sort of associate with why education is relevant for certain kinds of work.
Well, and I think this is one of the key insights, that this is a period of incredible transformation, and especially in the case of clerical and white collar work, that there is a new sort of imparting of skills for a new nature of work that opens up economic opportunities for some, and what you show is often for working class women. But nonetheless, there's this persistence of the segmentation and stratification along these various social categories. And I think your evidence really, we've used these words, racialized, gendered, that, are theoretical claims, but you really make this explicit with some of the evidence you find. So what I love, at the beginning of the book, you have, you comb classified advertisements and just go through them. And there are ads that say German preferred, right? A colored boy, young girls. And there's various ways to interpret these, but I really appreciate your analysis of these, that what this is chopping up the labor market into smaller groups that allows for different power differentials. You can pay a young girl less, right? You can shunt certain racial groups into certain types of jobs, so on and so forth. But that doesn't change, right? So at the end of the book, you have this incredible collection of correspondence from the job placement office at Harvard, and it kind of shows us this elite side of the labor market. And the letters are very similar to what the job ads used to be, right? You have letters saying from employers saying, we want a college man. We don't want chaps, which you show as sort of like a class marker of the time. Christians preferred for a law firm, which is an explicit exclusion of Jewish people. And so I think that really, I don't know if you agree with that characterization, but it captures this persistence of these hierarchies of power. And I think that's what you're trying to say about what we miss when we say skills, this power struggle.
Yeah, no, and also I think the fact that, one was sort of in public newspaper ads, you do start seeing more references to education. But what I was able to find with these sort of private correspondence between employers and, university officials is that behind the scenes, they're using a lot of this, pretty explicit racialized, or explicit language about their personal preferences. But to the outside world now, that looks like academic merit. It looks like you have a Harvard degree. That's why you're getting this job. So there's a way that these preferences get sort of covered up, under the guise of kind of academic merit, under the guise of educational credentials, even though we can still observe them operating in the labor market at the end.
So maybe this would be a good time to step back, because we've kind of mentioned some of the various places that you go with the research about your methodology. So on the one hand, you have these quantitative methods. You showed us these graphs. To my knowledge, you're one of the first, if not the first, historian to really methodically use these digitized census records, some really complicated computer modeling stuff that has powerful insights. But then also with all of the various kind of traditional archival sources of that historians tend to use, of diaries, newspapers, correspondence, government reports, and so on. And maybe say a bit about how you put this together. What was your method like in approaching all of these various bits of information?
Yeah, no, and this was sort of a fun part of the project, kind of exploring different historical methods. And I think it's something that I think social scientists, especially economists, are really familiar with. A lot of, especially ones that do historical research, are very familiar with the database that I used, which is called IPUM's data. This is basically digitized historical census data, where you can go in and download all kinds of variables from the census. That I was just looking at the city of Boston, but all kinds of really detailed information about individuals and households at the time. And it's something that historians, I think, there's been, or maybe this book is contributing to, a kind of revival of quantitative methods within history departments. But we have these really amazing resources at our fingertips, and I think I would, I hope that historians use them more and more. And what also for my project in the time period that I'm looking at, 1880 to 1940, right now we have access to 100% samples. So basically the entire, manuscript censuses from those years have been digitized. And that was happening, that sort of 1940 just came out. And IPUM's has just released these 100% samples for the previous years. So that aspect of the project, I think, is new, or I can claim to be one of the first to use these kind of throughout that time period. And yeah, I mean, these provide access to really fine-grained analysis of occupations. That was sort of the main way that I use these, but also demographic data, educational data. So these were really valuable just to, even just to know kind of basic numbers. I think probably to social scientists, the way that I use this data was like pretty basic, but, just to find out like what percentage of clerical workers were African American, which was a very low percentage, or were women over time, and having that really fine-grained, 100% access was really valuable. At the same time, what measuring or seeing different trends can't really explain why those trends took place. And this is where I also think historians should be using this data, because I think we also have a lot of other tools to contextualize what's going on. And so for that, I drew on a lot of archival sources, and I was going back to find, which exactly of the Mass Historical Society records ended up in the book. And there are a few here of the Charitable Mechanic Association, and then the Boston Central Labor Union records that are at Massachusetts Historical Society, that were a few of the ones that I used, but really to try to analyze, what were people, how did people make sense of labor markets that were so unequal, or how did they make sense of educational growth? Who was advocating for it? What were some of the politics behind it? So I think being able to use, now that technology has made quantitative data much easier, I think historians can really combine, use mixed methods to try to get at trends, but also really contextualize those trends with what they meant at the time, that you can't just get from the census or something like that.
So I think that's a good segue if we're talking about interpreting big trends. So at the beginning, you showed us this graph that's now become sort of infamous, of extremely high economic inequality in the 1920s, a big dip through the mid 20th century, and then spiking again in recent decades. And this has been called the Great Compression, when wages became the top and the bottom of the wage structure squeezed together. Some have called it the golden age of capitalism, when economic growth was shared more broadly, and various other characterizations. And so your argument, I think we have it right, is that it's not the expansion of public schooling that is causing this dip. And so if it's not schooling, then what is causing the dip? And I think this points straight to, I think, what the implications of what you want your argument to be. Where should we direct our attention in thinking about that dip in income inequality?
Yeah. So the way, right, the way that, and this is, I think, especially in the field of economics, the way that inequality has been explained, and right, in this chart, this sort of U-shaped chart, has often been that education and the expansion of public education was the primary driver. And the argument goes, if you expand, if more and more people are educated and they have access to more highly skilled jobs that are changing due to changing technology, then you're going to put downward pressure on wages at the top, because, right, lots of educated workers are going to be able to enter these jobs, and that will sort of compress the wage structure, create a more equal economy. And the argument then goes, the reason that inequality now is so high is because we don't have enough educated workers. So the solution becomes like more educated workers, more, college for all, like advocating for increased skills and training for individuals to be able to compete in the labor market. And I think what I try to show, especially for the early 20th century, is this was a period where education was expanding hugely, but inequality was also going up, which would, and same thing today, education is still growing, but so is inequality. And I think when we look at other factors, we can better explain what happens in the middle of the 20th century and sort of this dip. And that had more to do with really the balance of power between workers and employers in the economy. So the middle of the 20th century was when labor unionization was at, its height. It was when workers that were organized became the basis of political power and progressive policy making in the New Deal. So things like progressive taxation, right, which now is far less than it used to be in the middle of the 20th century, or things like minimum wage laws or other kinds of policies that weren't about education. They were actually about making sure that jobs themselves that workers would enter after they left school were actually well-paying and had good conditions. And what we've seen in recent years is sort of the complete erosion of labor unions, of a lot of policies that were put in place, sort of the erosion of our social safety net. And education was one of those components, but I think if we don't, it's sort of like in times when there are, when we already have an extremely unequal economy, just giving more people education is not going to create more well-paying jobs. And we've seen also how elites are very good at creating new barriers to entry. So as soon as you get a college degree, then it becomes, a master's degree or another professional degree on top of that to be able to access sort of elite positions. So we can't sort of educate ourselves out of an unequal society because of sort of these power structures. And that's why I think thinking about ways of increasing worker power, giving workers methods of empowering themselves, like that is going to be a better strategy than saying it's more education or more skills will suddenly make these jobs appear on the other end.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a very direct insight, but I think is very clarifying to say that to direct our sort of policy energy towards rethinking power in the labor market. And I think people themselves have come to this realization lately. We've seen an upsurge in in unionization across various fields, and kind of a return to kind of an labor organizing tradition. I mean, there's lots of places to go with this. I mean, a big question I have reading this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, is, you and I are both educators who spend our days teaching students. And certainly for people, a college degree unlocks certain opportunities, possibilities for them. But I think what you show is that it's by no means a guarantee, and the pathways are not equal. That there's, I kind of think of it as your book as there's different conveyor belts going to different places, and that, and so I mean, if we were to argue that as you just did, that we shouldn't think of schooling as providing direct payoffs in labor markets, what should the goal of schooling be? And I see you wrestling with this a bit in the book, and we'd love to hear you talk about it.
Yeah, no, and it's a great question, and one I think that can go in different ways. And so first I'll say, I think there's no denying that as an individual strategy of getting a better job, education does matter. And that's, the economy that we live in currently is one in which even a college degree is no guarantee, but you definitely need a college degree to have access to a lot of jobs that are the few jobs that are still well paying in the economy. I think the problem is that if that is the solution that is sort of promoted to everyone, well, then you can just drive forward this sort of credentials race and still not address, the lack of good jobs for everyone at the other end. So it's sort of, you have to, I think we have to acknowledge both like this as an individual strategy, that this is the economy that we live in. We can't sort of escape that immediately, but think about, okay, but what would it take to really start changing the economy as a whole? And there, I think, I mean, so one, I think educators are, as you kind of referred to, are some of the, the leading, are leading fights for workers' rights in many cities and, across the country. I think teacher unions, and organizing in K through 12, but also in higher education, that's also really expanded in recent years. I think we're seeing, a more clear understanding of how, well, education has, just because it's become so big and influential, it's also become a giant employer sector of the labor force. So thinking about just what it's going to take to actually be able to continue the work of education is also sort of a labor fight. But a lot of labor unions, I'm in Chicago these days, and the Chicago Teachers Union has also been advocating for a much broader understanding of like what the role of teacher unions is, and are really pushing kind of a wide range of policies that are about public investment in housing, right? So students don't have to be homeless when they're attending school, or kind of a wide range of policies that don't just have to do with education, but are really about empowering like whole communities. And I also think that students, I've been thinking about ways that we can expand our definition of education too, to like not just be the formal curriculum of schools, but sort of outside the traditional curriculum. I think like we've seen a huge surge in youth activism, in political campaigns, in the Bernie Sanders campaign, in mass uprisings around police brutality or gun violence. And I think, young people are learning the kinds of organizing and mobilization strategies, maybe not in their classrooms, but in sort of their work in their communities. And that, I think we should also think about that as a form of education that would be that is going to be really necessary if we want to see more worker empowerment down the road. And then finally, I'll add that I think, if in some ways, if we could, if we can ensure that there are actually, good jobs that provide some sort of stability and security for students after they leave education, I think that would also alleviate the burden now that's on education to like be this pathway to work, and free up education for all kinds of other things that like now we can sort of dream about and imagine. But until that happens, I think education is actually really constricted, because so many students, rightfully so, are looking at their education as a way of getting a job. So if we can sort of take care of one of those pieces, that would allow us to be more flexible in our education space.
Yeah, I mean, so if I'm hearing you right, it's that we should expand our thinking of an educational experience beyond just a credential that is supposed to deliver certain payoffs in a labor market, to think more broadly of educators themselves as workers, to think of various structural interventions in the economy that provide economic security and a sort of safety net for people, and even I think modes of learning beyond formal schooling, I think, which is, I think, a really helpful kind of expansive way to think of these things. I'm sure people will get to these in their questions. I'm starting to see them. There's all kinds of contemporary implications. Something that I really thought of with this is that one of your critiques is that with elite sort of race, I can't think of a better phrase, but we'll use it, race to the top of kind of credentializing to kind of protect the reproduction of elite status. You show this with that Harvard correspondence and various other elite institutions, and then you have this argument that this notion of merit, that people have earned it, when you have evidence showing the opposite, which is a powerful insight. Something I thought of reading this, though, is this the recent college cheating scandal, and my takeaway from this was that I don't know, something profound has changed in this sort of like notions of merit. That, to me, my interpretation of the scandal is that we had people with immense resources, right? Enough to spend exorbitant amounts of money to pay their way into college, but somehow feeling so insecure themselves near the top. And I wonder, is this a reflection? I mean, yeah, how do you see ways merit has changed in recent decades? What would your interpretation be of this kind of new arms race around test prep, around college admissions, and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, I think like the driving force even of college going in the time period that I'm looking at was always driven, yeah, to a large extent by anxiety, by like status anxiety, even, I mean, by elites. And in with the period I'm looking at, there was a lot of, you know, the traditional Boston Brahmin that had made their money through finance and trade. Like they were being threatened by new industrial wealth out west or finance in New York. And then from the bottom, from below, by, you know, all these women that were now accessing white collar jobs that basically turned high school into a more exclusive marker, into something that, you know, was common and that everybody had. And so elite strategies of, you know, developing new relationships with universities and key areas of the economy and key sectors and professions. I mean, I see that as being a reaction to, you know, and of course, you know, immigrants also entering many new professions like law and medicine. So there, yeah, I mean, there's always sort of anxiety and maintain the maintenance of class position through elite education. And I think, you know, we're nowadays, I think the insecurity is also is in an increasingly unequal society where an even fewer number have access to these top positions. I think like a wider swath of, I don't know, the top 10% are also like feeling insecure, which seems ridiculous to everybody else, but I think also can sort of drive forward ways of trying to ensure in any possible way the advantages that they can pass on to their children. And because, again, like because it really does matter materially where you go to school or what kinds of degrees you have, I think we're seeing that just play out among elites who can then use money in ways that maybe they always have to try to ensure that class position.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's a really interesting kind of thought that it's again, going with one of the themes of your book, it's this persistence. It's actually more of the same. Maybe that's not something that should be so shocking and different. I'm thinking back again to your, you know, the graph of income inequality. And if we're back in a world where of economic polarization, where there's a small number of haves and a large number of have-nots and not a lot of space in between, then there's a long distance to fall. And so, yeah, maybe we can see this as a reflection of things that happened in the early 20th century. So we are starting to get some questions from the audience, and I encourage others to send one if you'd like to hear Professor Groeger talk about any particular issue. So here's one question. What are your thoughts about the recent push against education as a link to the workforce? You know, for example, dropping out of college, living out of a van, and becoming a small business owner. I mean, the question uses the phrase small business owner. I'm also thinking of maybe the Silicon Valley phenomenon of explicitly rejecting higher education credential as necessary to be an entrepreneur. Yeah, what are your thoughts on this phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing, it's interesting seeing critiques of education like across the political spectrum with a lot of different implications. But the one of sort of, well, like Bill Gates didn't finish school, like sort of following like an entrepreneurial model. I think there the problem is like, well, a lot of startups, like you still need some kind of economic some sort of financial support at the very beginning, and it's still, we can't sort of just abandon the way that education does function in a lot of different ways in our economy, and drop it because the labor market and jobs like are very uncertain. And especially I think in startup culture, most don't make it. And so that's also, like until we can provide some kind of safety net, I think that will always, those kinds of like becoming an entrepreneur, I think will always favor those who have a little bit of something to fall back on. So it's I think pushing back on like the ways that our educational system don't always provide economic stability or security is accurate, but I don't see that as sort of a path. That's also sort of a very individualized path out that I don't think sort of could work on like a mass scale of providing some kind of security for most people.
Well, and back to your critique of skills, something that comes through in the book over and over again is that there's all kinds of things that people are getting from different educational experiences. And on the elite level, one of these key things that, say, a Harvard degree offers is social networks. And so I'm thinking of,
Right.
We could interpret on the one hand, Mark Zuckerberg dropping out of Harvard, that he didn't need Harvard to start Facebook. But on the other hand, I think your book would point us to maybe he got what he needed from Harvard. I mean, it's kind of makes the analogy ridiculous, but making an elite social network, like, this was something that grew out of Harvard, even if it wasn't the degree granting credential side of it. Mm-hmm. So here's another question that I probably should have asked earlier. So let's talk about it. What made this a project about Boston? Why is Boston the right place to look at these questions?
Yeah, good question. I mean, one, I think for educational history, like Boston has a very special place as just, home of some of the oldest institutions, both public and private. And what made it really useful for me was just sort of the range of institutional types dating that are very old, or that date back to at least the 19th century, of trade schools and commercial schools, and a very kind of rich archival record of those schools. So in looking at how schools were sort of changing and evolving in relationship to the labor market, there was a lot there to work with and a lot of data to work with. Otherwise, I mean, Boston in that time period was fairly, it was a commercial center, a large industrial center. It does share a lot of characteristics with other large Northern American cities. The American South, I think, has a very different dynamic, both with the labor market and with education. And one sort of demographic difference about Boston compared to other Northern American cities is that it had a much smaller African American population. So I was able to look at trends around African American education because of, this very like fine-grained census data, and actually found that African Americans were getting educated at higher rates than, say, white immigrants for much of this period, which was really interesting. And like sort of racial segregation does not take hold in the same way before 1940 that it does in other US cities in Boston. So that made it a little bit unusual. But it has the same rate of immigration as other cities. So the ethnic politics and a lot of the class politics around schooling were also pretty similar. So I think there are a lot of, I think the general arc of the story and the role of white collar work that is shared across sort of the urban north in this period. There are a lot of lessons that we can learn from Boston that are applicable, even though it was unique in some of its features. And one other thing I'll add is just the role of private universities in the Northeast is also really interesting and something that makes it different from Western states, which had a much longer tradition of large public universities. Boston area private universities are very powerful and able to prevent a public university in Boston until UMass Boston in the 1960s. So there are some unique features, but some of the bigger trends I think are shared across much of the United States.
Yeah, I mean, it's always the classic question that's hard about why a case study, but I think you make a compelling case that the rich educational landscape of Boston makes it really ripe for this sort of analysis, sort of leads school enrollments nationally, and also has this elite class of Brahmins that kind of directed the American corporate consolidation in certain ways. So those things together make for it being a really compelling case study. So another question from the audience. In recent years, it's been harder to attract adults to the trades, in spite of the good salaries they often pay. So what are your thoughts on kind of the barriers to entry? And I know you have a lot on this book, so this is a great question. And what's driving this in your opinion? Is it a valuation, a cultural valuation of these not being of these being lower status jobs than others, something else? What can explain this?
Yeah, no, I'm glad we have this question, because I have a chapter on craft work and really the conflict over training, apprenticeship training in this time period that I think is very illuminating, because in the 19th century as well as now, there were constantly reformers who were arguing we need to expand training in the trades that will, similar to other kinds of sectors, like if we can expand training, then this will provide more access into a well-paying craft. It will help revitalize the crafts. Germany was usually looked to as an example country, the same way that Germany and other European countries today, I think we sort of look to them for their vocational training systems. What I find though in Boston, and I think in many other cities, is that because craft unions, because their power basically derived from being able to control access to the trades, they were very opposed to employer efforts to expand industrial education, which employers very explicitly saw as kind of a union busting measure. So they wanted to train their workers more cheaply outside of like a union regulated apprenticeship. Unions were, because craft workers were some of the only workers in this period that had some organized power, they were able to limit the expansion and just the success of these industrial education programs, which in turn leads to, I think, this very American model of pursuing mass production, which entails, like for the labor market, entails fewer craft workers, more machine operators that were usually recent immigrants that could be paid far less, and in like mass production industries and corporations, white collar workers that were also usually women could be paid less than unionized craft workers. And the reason that I think, the mass production model now in the US has meant that the types of jobs that would be well paying, in metal work, were kind of eliminated in this period. And I think today the building trades are one of the few examples of like what's still a well-paying job, but that was like the exception. Those were the few cases where unions actually were able to maintain their power, whereas in a lot of other, for metal trades, like their unions were almost entirely crushed. So I think the solution is not, that we need more training, because I think we're still going to run into the same political problems there. I think what makes the trades, or some of the building trades, appealing now is that there are some of the few kinds of work that pay well, right? That are still well-paying jobs. And that has to do with the power of craft unions. If other kinds of jobs had more power, were able to be unionized, I think we could create, if other kinds of service sector work had powerful unions, those would become, the good, well-paying jobs of the era. But I think imagining that if we just sort of had a European style training system, that sort of ignores the politics that have really like eliminated whole sectors of work in an American context.
Yeah, and I mean, you have a lot of striking examples of various craft unions opposing explicitly expanding the various training programs, because it would undercut their power of saying, how to learn to be a welder, and yeah, the building trades we can think of as a persistence of that model. And you say this part particularly because of the nature of decentralized construction work. There is so one question, I think it braids a few together here. What are your thoughts on recent efforts to make college, public universities, community colleges more affordable? Debt cancellation is something that's been discussed heavily in recent political campaigns. Do you think these will have payoffs in the labor market? Why or why not?
Yeah, no, I think in some ways nowadays, like the burden of education is even higher than it used to be, because tuition rates, right, have skyrocketed, because student debt has skyrocketed. So at the same time that education is becoming more and more important for certain labor market outcomes, or at least like a necessary condition to even compete for some jobs, it's also becoming more and more of a burden, a real financial burden on students, and often the most marginalized communities, right, that don't have rich parents that can pay for their tuition off the bat. So, I mean, I think it speaks to why, focusing on education is dangerous, because it puts the burden onto individuals rather than on sort of broader structures of reform. And I think, like, my position is, at minimum, yes, we need college to be tuition and debt free. That should be, there's no reason why the US needs to be the only country that has, these ridiculous tuition and debt and student debt rates. At the same time, I think that alone will not, right, even if everyone could get a college education completely debt and tuition free, that still wouldn't create good jobs at the other end. So we need more than that, but I think, as sort of a minimum demand, I think definitely, like, the way that student debt now kind of serves as like even more of a financial burden on students into their older age is really problematic. So that would sort of be how I would see the priorities.
I mean, if anything, I think what's become a student debt crisis is the heightening of what you call the education trap. I think of young people essentially gambling, betting that this will have an economic payoff. And sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. It creates long-term kind of stress that we're seeing. So we're up towards the end. We have one last, it's not quite a question, it's more of a comment, and I think it really ties everything together. So I'm just going to read it. We have a submission from Tim Groves, your former principal at King Open School.
Oh my gosh.
So I'm just going to read what he said. So he said, some of us who were part of the faculty there hope that some of what we believed in, we're fighting for, is coming. We appreciate that's coming to view powerfully in the work and advocacy that you are doing. So your old educators have come back to appreciate your work.
Great. Yes. Well, that was especially fun getting to do this project as someone who grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and attended public schools there. So thank you, Principal Groves.
Great. So I just wanted to thank both of you as a fellow Cambridge resident who was a product of the Cambridge public school system. We're well represented, so, at least in this program. But thank you both for a great presentation. And I'd like to thank all of our guests for attending. And I hope that if people would like, they are interested in buying a copy. Oops, that's not what I meant. They will look into purchasing a copy of this book. We'll hope you go to bookshop.org and support a local business. So thank you all for your time, and thank you, Professor Glass and Professor Groeger, for a great presentation. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.